Liberal leader Grayson Holt thought he had the situation under control, but when Caroline Levitt challenged him, everything changed. The surprise attack, full of confidence and coolness, turned the debate upside down and destroyed Holt's foundation. Why couldn't he respond to her challenge? How did Levitt end up on the podium and Holt in the middle of a scandal? Find out in this gripping video. Don't miss the shocking moment. Watch until the end. When Grayson Holt walked into the studio, he felt the atmosphere literally fill him with confidence. His show was his kingdom, and the audience was just guests in his theater, ready to listen to his caustic jokes and deft manipulations. He knew he had all the aces to outshine any guest. But tonight was something special. He was ready to start the show, as always, with a shock dose of sarcasm aimed at the young conservative star Caroline Levitt. The studio was filled with light and buzz as he stepped behind the microphone. Holt glanced quickly at Caroline, the nurse across from him. She was calm, perhaps too calm, behind him, expecting to be attacked, as usual. But that only fueled his confidence. He began. "So, Caroline," he began, his voice dripping with characteristic mockery. "You probably didn't come here for politics, did you? No, you came here to take your place on Fox News, because everyone knows there's enough ambition in this world to make common sense go away." The crowd giggled, and Holt felt their laughter adding fuel to his victory. He was ready, because his sarcasm was right on target. "You're not against good old conservative ideas, are you? You're not trying to sell what was sold to you, are you?" He continued, toying with the idea that she was just another puppet in the hands of a serious political machine. "All you have to offer is a bunch of rehearsed phrases, right?" But at this moment, Caroline Levitt, sitting calmly in her chair, was in no hurry at all. She was not thinking of justifying herself or engaging in a verbal duel. She simply sat, her gaze cold and collected. Everyone expected her to give in now. She was silent, and this made Holt feel strangely tense. Holt, unable to resist continuing, went on the attack again. "That's what I don't like about people like you. It's all just a bunch of talk about taxes and personal responsibility. You probably don't even know what you're talking about, do you?" He said it with such contempt that there was a slight tension in the studio. Caroline sat motionless, her expression as clear as a knife blade, but her gaze was silent. She was not thinking of substantiating her position, not thinking of entering into an empty bargain for attention. She was simply a nurse. Holt tried again to reassert his authority. "I don't think you want to hop politics seriously, Caroline. You're here because you've changed, and you're just one of those people trying to fit in with the old party without even knowing how it works." But at that moment, when his words began to sound more and more arrogant, Caroline suddenly broke the silence. Without a single movement, she said, "Are you finished?" A sudden silence filled the studio. Holt fell silent, and his sarcasm suddenly lost its force. This question, asked with such cool confidence, confused him. He felt his confidence begin to fade. He had always been on a pedestal, always in control. But now, at this moment, when he expected an easy victory, she was directly challenging him. Everyone in the studio froze. The storm and the tempest that Holt had so carefully built up were destroyed in a matter of seconds. The audience felt the tension building. There was no weakness on Caroline's part in that brief but powerful moment. She wasn't scared. She wasn't making excuses. She had simply asked a question that had broken his defenses. "Are you done?" Her question echoed in the air, and everyone knew the show would never be the same again. When Caroline Levitt asked, "Are you done?" the studio literally froze. The pause was so long that even the camera seemed to be waiting for what was going to happen next. Grayson Holt, accustomed to being the center of attention and a master manipulator, was stumped. But instead of answering her call, he rushed to regain control of the situation. He tried to return to his usual tactics, sarcasm and mockery. He was sure that this was how the noise level would increase, but now everything had changed. "So, Caroline, do you realize that you're beating me with that cold tone?" Holt said mockingly, getting noticeably closer to getting his property back. "You came here to pass on your naive ideas, but frankly, I doubt you understand anything about this statement." The audience, who had recently laughed at her silence, now froze in anticipation. However, Levitt not only did not panic, but continued to maintain incredible calm. She seemed to ignore his words, standing like a rock, confident, unperturbed, calm. "You're saying the same thing again, Grayson," she said quietly but firmly, not allowing the slightest spark of emotion to creep into her voice. "Your constant attacks are just cliches you repeat from show to show, hoping someone will believe them. But I'm not here to defeat your script." Holt, who hadn't expected this answer, felt his confidence begin to fade. He was always the one to set the tone in any discussion, but Caroline had openly invited him to question his methods. He tried to attack again. So you think this is all just a show, huh? His voice became even more defiant. You think you can beat me with just your ideals and cliches? All you are is a bunch of standard conservative cliches. But Levitt, instead of engaging in endless argumentation, again went on the counterattack. You don't understand, Grayson, she said, her voice low, but her words were like an icy blow. You have to control the conversation, to bend people to your idea of what's right. But that's not me. I'm not going to be your puppet in a show you're putting on. This isn't your show. The studio went silent. She hadn't just broken the mold of his tactics, she had told him outright that his usual methods of manipulation were no longer working. The audience began to sense that something very important was happening here and now. You don't really want to discuss the country's problems, do you? Levitt continued, giving Holt no time to respond. You just want to show off your cleverness by making me feel awkward, don't you? But I won't be the butt of your jokes. She was not emotional, she did not shout, she did not expect to find her right at the level of rhetoric. There was no threat or panic in her voice, only clear confidence. This moment was extremely important. She did not leave Holt in control of herself, and her words left no room for manipulation. The audience began to whisper. They felt everything changing. This wasn't just a performance. Caroline Levitt had just destroyed the most fundamental principle of Holt's show. She wasn't his victim. Holt clearly didn't know how to respond. His face went pale. He opened his mouth again, but the words stuck. Everything he was used to doing didn't work. You, he muttered, his confidence beginning to crack. You just don't get it. Caroline no longer waited for him to answer. She was a nurse, calm and collected, as if her position was obvious. With every word she said, Holt lost more and more control over the service. You keep using the same old tricks that work on those who are ready for such a prognosis, she finished, and her words hung in the air like a sentence. But you won't fool me. And then, at that moment, it was clear, the game had changed. Grayson Holt felt his confidence begin to crack. He had always been the center of attention, always the one who controlled the conversations and discussions. But here, in front of Caroline Levitt, he was trapped, and she hadn't lifted a finger to give him a chance to win. Everything he said seemed to only erode his presence. Seriously, Caroline, he began, trying to regain his grip, but his voice was far less confident. You think you're winning me over just by being cool and confident? This isn't politics. This is a show, and you don't seem to understand that. The audience began to murmur. Clearly, they too sensed something changing in the show's dynamics. Holt was trying to regain control, but his voice was increasingly sounding like a plaintive attempt at justification. Caroline, meanwhile, sat up straight, her face unreadable. You still stand your ground, Grayson, she said quietly but firmly. But I didn't come to your expectations. I didn't come here to play your game. I won't come to you as a leader who's always right. I came here to tell the truth. The words seemed to strike at his own style. She hadn't argued with him on topic. She had no intention of winning the argument with culinary phrases and arguments he could debunk. She had simply called his manipulations what they were. A trap. Empty words. And, most importantly, she had left him without a weapon. Your job is to manipulate people, to create a show, not to find solutions, she continued, her words growing more powerful, like thunderclouds. You don't want to talk about any of the problems. You want me to look stupid. You want me to be your laughingstock. The tension was palpable. This wasn't just an argument. It was a revelation, a moment when one man's career was about to be revealed to everyone. Holt tried to take a step back, but his face no longer showed confidence. His attempt to regain control of the game looked increasingly artificial. You. His voice shook. You think I don't understand that you're here for PR? You. This is all just a show, Carolina. You're young, you're ambitious, and you just need a place on TV. But she didn't move. She didn't even laugh. Caroline was as steadfast as ever, and her eyes showed no fear. There was no hint of resentment in her answers. She doesn't think to justify herself. She doesn't think to explain her position. You're right, I am ambitious, she said, not looking away. But I don't want your show, Grayson. I didn't come here to please you and your audience. I came here so you could see what real conversation looks like. Holt was speechless. He tried to find an answer, but the words wouldn't come. Caroline had destroyed everything he had built, and it wasn't just a fall, it was. Suddenly, the studio felt the world around them changing. Viewers began to realize that Holt's show, in which he had always been king, was losing its power. He had lost not only control of the conversation, but also his ability to manipulate. "You didn't beat me," Caroline said, her words like the final blow. "You just didn't understand that I'm not here to play by your rules." And in that moment, Holt realized what he had lost. All his control, all his illusions were gone. The great mass that remained was the emptiness that filled the studio. Grayson Holt sat, trying to reassemble himself. He had always been a master of service, controlling every word, every response. But this was different. Caroline Levitt had not only resisted his manipulations, she had destroyed all his tactics. And it made him wonder how his authority was fading, and his words were meaningless. He frowned and, clenching the numbers, tried to take control of the situation again. "You don't understand that politics isn't just pretty words, Carolina. It's a fight. It's a plan. Do you think you can just come in and start giving advice?" His voice was a little nervous, but he still managed to maintain a confident look. "You don't even know what you're dealing with." But instead of giving him a chance to win, Caroline looked at him again calmly and without any falsehood in her eyes. "Grayson, you keep saying the same thing over and over, and all I hear is a sad attempt to make me doubt myself. But you have no argument. It's all empty talk you do to shift the focus away from the first issues," she said, without changing her tone, but her words seemed to cut through the silence of the studio. "You want to talk about the region? About strategy? You don't understand that fighting for the future is not what you do every day on this show. This is life, not a circus." In that moment, it became clear. Her calm wasn't just confidence, it was real strength. Holt couldn't seem to understand it. He expected her to be found out, to start making excuses, to tear the mask off her face and show how hard it was for her. But she didn't. Instead, she spoke the truth outright, and it shocked Holt. "You're always trying to follow people, saying they're too young, too ambitious to understand. You say that about anyone who dares to oppose you, don't you?" Caroline continued, her voice growing firmer. "You just want to be smarter. You want to put everyone in their place. But what you're really afraid of is that someone might outsmart you." Her words were right on target. With each statement you made, Holt felt the ground shift from under his feet. He had expected this conversation to be easy, for him to be the center of attention again, for him to be in control of the scenario again. But now Caroline was in control. "You used your tricks, your old tricks, but they don't work here. I will not be your laughingstock, and I will not let you play me on this show," she said, almost defiantly. "You want to talk about some of your problems? Fine. Then don't try to make fun of me." Grayson tried to continue his conversation, but his voice became hollow. His confidence began to fade. The audience began to understand how Holt was in control of the situation, how his words became increasingly unconvincing, and his words found less and less resonance in the studios. "I'm not here to justify myself to you," Caroline said so clearly that her words hung in the air. "I'm not going to be part of your game." That was the moment Holt knew he had lost. She hadn't given in to a single word of his manipulation. He, who had always controlled every interview, who was used to people retreating into the shadows under his pressure, found himself in a situation where his methods weren't working. And worst of all, he didn't know how to get out of it. She continued, without slowing down, "You want to beat me using your old tricks. But you're losing, Grayson. And I'm not going to wait for you to start asking questions that I understand, because you don't understand material issues." The studio was silent. Caroline's words hung in the air, and her confidence was a real blow to Holt. He was no longer able to respond. The audience began to realize that Holt's career, which he had built for so long, had just gone down the drain. He sat, and every glance he took in Carolina's direction increasingly resembled the consequences. Grayson Holt, feeling his grip on the economy slipping, tried to take a breather. He had always been able to manipulate a conversation, always a master of sarcasm and irony. But something in the way Caroline Levitt held herself struck a strange justice in him. She had given him no chance to push her, no roll out of weakness. There was no fear or worry in her gaze. Instead of letting her guard down, she stood her ground, more confident than ever. Holt watches closely and tries to seize the initiative. He knew his reputation was on the line, and he was willing to do anything to regain control. But instead of changing tactics, he took another step back and tried to draw her out on emotion. "Carolina, aren't you ashamed?" he said, trying to put contempt into his voice. "You think your youth and ambition are what wins you? Is that all you are? You're just another feckless idealist trying to be part of the show." He had expected her reaction to be emotional, that she would finally go into a blunt defense. But instead, her face remained as calm as before. Caroline simply exhaled and answered without the slightest strain in her voice. I'm not ashamed of my belief in my faith, Grayson. I'm not ashamed of the fact that I believe in real change. And yes, I'm young, ambitious, and willing to fight for what I believe in. Holt felt his head begin to spin. He had always played with people, manipulated them, but Caroline had not left him with that. He was no longer the center of attention, no longer able to make fun of his weaknesses. Every word she said penetrated his defenses, and he felt that the resistance not only controlled him, but also his face in front of the audience. You think you can change everything with one word. Holt continues, but his voice is no longer as confident. Politics isn't for people like you. It's hard work, long hours. You don't even realize what you're dealing with. There you go again, Caroline interrupted, her voice now a mantra of confidence. You're trying to beat me over the head with the idea that my beliefs are just easy words. But I'll tell you, Grayson, your mistake is that you think political ideas are something to be played out for show. You're afraid that we who really think won't let you manipulate us. It was a low blow. Holt felt his face begin to burn with anger, but there was no conviction in his eyes. He tried to press the attack, but the words wouldn't come. All he could do was listen as she rattled off his arguments one by one. You want to talk? Here's a talk, Caroline continued, not allowing him a break. You use the show to hide your inability to solve real problems. You don't want to fight for the future. You want to be the main character in a show where everyone submits to your manipulations. The words cut off the last vestiges of Holt's confidence. He sat there, unsure of what to say. He was in shock. He had always known that when a man entered into a debate over economic control, it was the end. But he had not expected his vulnerability to be revealed so quickly. Levitt was not just a conflict. She was his antithesis, and her strength was that she did not play games with him. She simply told the truth, and that deprived him of the ability to manipulate his health. The studio audience began to murmur, noticing Holt's influence on your influence. The silence that had fallen became even more palpable. Caroline looked at him, her eyes filled with calm determination. Not only had she won this moment, but she had completely ruined his entrance. You still don't get it, do you? Caroline paused, her voice sounding as it had been said before. You're trying to beat me with a tactic that hasn't worked for a long time. But I won't be your target. And you know it. At that moment, Holt realized that his actions had been empty. He had lost not only a controlled conversation, but also the most important thing he had, power. Grayson Holt sat in his chair, his face pale and his eyes empty of confidence. He knew that everything he had built up over the years was now staring the audience in the face. Caroline Levitt sat across from him, completely calm, and he could no longer regain control. He tried to restore his reputation by trying to speak with the same arrogant tone he loved so much. But something about her demeanor made his words sound empty and meaningless. You think you can beat me just like that? He finally managed to squeeze out, trying to regain some control over the renovation. You probably realize that your youth and ambition help you change everything, but you don't really understand what you're up against. But Caroline didn't even raise an eyebrow. Instead of responding to his rudeness, she simply looked at him with a quiet, confident expression. Grayson, you don't understand what's going on, she said calmly, without changing her tone. You're sitting here trying to manipulate me and joke around, thinking that all these tricks will work, but you're wrong. This isn't your game, and you can't beat me because I'm not falling for your tricks. Caroline's words, calm and sharp as a buckle, completely threw Holt off balance. He had always been a master of manipulation, always making his conflicts feel awkward, but here he was helpless. The studio audience began to feel the situation spiraling out of control. You say you don't play by my rules, but you don't understand how the world works, he shouted, desperately trying to recapture some of the common ground he had lost. Politics isn't just talking about how you want things to be. It's fighting, it's compromising, it's doing something. But Caroline didn't give up. She was as high as ever, and her next answer came with such force that Holt felt his arguments vanish into thin air. You think politics is just a game of compromise, where you have to please everyone, where you just sell your ideas to make more money and popularity. Her voice was furious, and there was no fear or doubt in it. Grayson, this is not a game. We are talking about the future of this country, and you are talking about your ratings and how to please your viewer. You do not see that your show has no relation whatsoever to the politics of observation. The audience began to whisper. The atmosphere in the studio became dense, tense, as if there was a vital charge in the air. They knew that this was not just a conversation, but a clash of two worldviews. Carolina literally destroyed the foundations on which Holt had built his foundation. Holt, who had always been smart, experienced, now seemed like a man who could not find a single logical answer. You just can't understand that people like you are no longer in fashion, Caroline continued. You can laugh at me. Criminals can humiliate me, but I'm not here to make excuses. I'm here to show you what a real conversation looks like. The studio audience began to realize that Holt was no longer in control of the conversation. His face had gone pale, and he didn't know what to say. Caroline had taken things to the next level by not trying to fight him on his terms. She didn't go viral. She didn't make excuses. She simply showed him that his approach was outdated. "You're losing," she said, her voice low, but her words were like a death sentence. "You just can't win because you don't understand how the world has changed." Those words were the last straw for Holt. His show, his career, his confidence, everything he had held to be immutable, had crumbled in an instant. Caroline had not only challenged his methods, she had destroyed the world he had so carefully constructed. The studio was silent. Holt's career, his reputation, his influence, all were on the brink of collapse. And Caroline Levitt, with a quiet but unwavering confidence, conquered the battle without wasting any extra emotion on it. Grayson Holt sat with his hands clenched into fists, unable to accommodate everything he had built, crumbling before his eyes. Caroline Levitt had not only reversed his manipulations, she had literally destroyed his foundation in a matter of minutes. Every response she had made was as precise as a hammer blow, and despite his best efforts to pull himself out of this hole, he was losing his grip more and more. His eyes were no longer confident, and instead of the sarcasm with which he so skillfully manipulated people, there was only emptiness. The studio was dead silent. The audience watched Holt's defeat, each one feeling his reputation flash before them. Holt looked at Caroline, his face pale, his breathing quick. He didn't know how to react to her calm, her confidence. He was ready to attack, but she wasn't playing his game. She didn't go viral, she just took his game out of his hands. "You can't beat me, Grayson," she said, and her words penetrated the deepest part of her soul. Caroline remained seated in her chair, her expression relaxed, not showing that victory was already in her grasp. "You've lost control. You're not running the show anymore. All you can do is sit here and watch me take your victory." Holt froze. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Her words still rang in his ears, and he felt his career beginning to turn into an empty shell that no one respected anymore. He tried to find the words, but they didn't come. What had once seemed like absolute power was now an indictment of his humiliation. Caroline continued to bring him down with ease with each new blow. "You were a master manipulator, Grayson," Caroline continued, her voice soft, but with an undertone so firm and confident it was like a blow to the head. "But you forgot one thing about me. I don't give in to manipulation. You thought that if you mocked me, people would believe you were right. But everyone can see who you really are." The words pierced the silence in the studio like a knife edge. Holt couldn't resist. He was too arrogant, too confident in his power, to realize that his behavior no longer had any power. He began to realize that the situation was out of his control, and that it would be impossible to regain his former popularity. Caroline paused, letting her words hang in the air. It was a moment of victory. There was no emotion, no wavering in her tone. She was a stone wall. When she spoke, people listened. All you did was put on a show, and you got so caught up in it that you forgot what you were actually supposed to be talking about. She took a step forward, not taking her eyes off Holt. "You used that show to bully and manipulate people. And I'm here to affirm that true power is the ability to speak the truth, even when that truth is inconvenient." Every word she said was like a rock, hitting Holt harder each time. He knew the audience understood. He knew that Caroline had taken everything he had, and now she controlled not only the show, but his future. The shock in the studio was palpable. He tries to re-enter the discussion, but his voice no longer has the confident conclusion it had before. "Do you think this will all end for me?" he asks, but his words now sound like a simple excuse. "Do you think you can defeat me?" Caroline looked at him without the slightest suggestion. "No, Grayson. I don't think." "I know," she replied, and her words were the final blow that Holt couldn't avoid. The audience began to applaud, not because they were on anyone's side. They had fertilized a victory of confidence, a victory of truth, A victory that came not with hysteria and manipulation but with the simple realization that Holt's time had passed. Caroline Levitt had not just won the moment, she had changed the rules of the game, changing the entire landscape of logical debate. At that moment, it became clear Grayson Holt had lost not only his control of the debate, but also his base. He had become just part of a bygone era that would never return. After Grayson Holt left the studio, his face was covered in shame and his reputation was in tatters. He, who had always been on a pedestal, now felt like his world had collapsed. Levitt, without taking a single extra step, stood her ground, her confidence growing stronger. She had literally beaten him at the game he was a master at. But the saddest thing was that her victory was not based on flashy attacks or emotional outbursts. She had simply played her game and left him without a weapon. Everyone in the studio was stunned. Caroline hadn't just won this debate, she'd changed the rules. Holt had always been the one who owned the stage, the one who had the last word. But today, he appeared as the victim, and his silence in the face of her onslaught spoke volumes. When the camera finally turned off, Caroline was in no hurry to leave the studio. She was a nurse, as if nothing had happened, and the people who were with her at that moment were all the same. She had not just won anything, she had won the battle for the future. Everyone knew that this was not just an incident. This was a historic moment that changed the course of political debate forever. "So, Grayson, do you still think you have this game under control?" she commented as the student lights dimmed and everyone began to leave. She didn't shout, didn't make a speech about her victory. Caroline simply knew what she had done. She didn't need the fruits or the recognition. She had won, and that was enough. Levitt, the young political leader, had just demonstrated his true power. Not through grand promises, not through manipulation, but through cool confidence and the ability to resist provocation. Holt was someone who was used to dominating, who always knew how to do things his way. But today, at this moment, his habits did not work. Caroline Levitt had not only shown that she could be on equal terms with someone like him, but she had also destroyed his entire image. Weeks passed, and there was not a single day when the news channels did not discuss her victory. Viral clips of her responses to Holt were watched by millions, and every comment was filled with respect for her ability to take a punch and not be fooled. Caroline gained incredible popularity, and her name became a symbol of a new generation of politicians who can speak frankly, confidently, and without fear. As for Holt, his career was not as bright as it used to be. His show lost ratings, and his manipulations began to be perceived as polite and comfortable. The media began to highlight his defeat, and all his attempts to justify himself only undermined his authority further. "So what you were really afraid of was," the studio now said, discussing his downfall. "You were afraid that someone would be able to speak out against you and not be destroyed by your words." At that moment, it became clear Caroline Levitt hadn't just taken over one TV show, she'd rewritten the rules. She wasn't trying to be someone who catered to the masses or garnered attention with flashy slogans. She'd done much more. She taught everyone that confidence, honesty, and not being swayed by gimmicks were real weapons. Caroline was the new face of the fight scene. And this scene was no longer the one that Holt and I knew, who were used to manipulation. The politics of a new generation were here. And they had already won. In one moment, Caroline Levitt destroyed everything Grayson Holt had spent years building. His confidence, his manipulation, his control, all of it stood in stark contrast to her coolness and truth. That moment in the political debate changed the game forever. Holt would never return to the top. Caroline became the new face of politics, confident in its future and ready to fight for real change. Don't miss how this shocking victory will impact the entire political landscape. Subscribe to our channel, like and hit the bell so you don't miss the next stories that will shake you to the core.